truth, and poured out her full heart in gratitude, hope, joy, blissful ecstasy, and all for him. I shall see him as I never saw him yet. I shall see my dear love with the dark cloud cleared away. I shall see him as my poor mother saw him long ago. Oh, my dear, my dear! Oh, father, father! Oh, thank God, thank God!" He yielded himself to her kisses and caresses, but did not return them, except that he put an arm about her. Neither did he say one word. His steadfast look was now divided between her and Clennam, and he began to shake as if he were very cold. Explaining to little Dorrit that he would run to the coffee-house for a bottle of wine, Arthur fetched it with all the haste he could use. While it was being brought from the cellar to the bar, a number of excited people asked him what had happened, when he hurriedly informed them that Mr. Dorrit had succeeded to a fortune. On coming back with the wine in his hand, he found that she had placed her father in his easy-chair and had loosened his shirt and neckcloth. They filled a tumbler with wine and held it to his lips. When he had swallowed a little, he took the glass himself and emptied it. Soon after that, he leaned back in his chair and cried, with his handkerchief before his face. After this had lasted a while, Clennam thought it a good reason for diverting his attention from the main surprise by relating its details. Slowly, therefore, in a quiet tone of voice, he explained them as best he could, and enlarged on the nature of Panks's service. He shall be handsomely recompensed, sir," said the father, starting up and moving hurriedly about the room. "Assure yourself, Mr. Clennam, that everybody concerned shall be nobly rewarded. No one, my dear sir, shall say that he has an unsatisfied claim against me. I shall repay the advances I have had from you, sir, with peculiar pleasure. I beg to be informed at your earliest convenience what advances you have made my son." He had no purpose in going about the room, but he was not still a moment. "Everybody," he said, "shall be remembered. I will not go away from here in anybody's debt. All the people who have been well behaved towards myself and my family shall be rewarded. Chivery shall be rewarded. Young John shall be rewarded. I particularly wish and intend to act munificently, Mr. Clennam." "Will you allow me," said Arthur, laying his purse on the table, "to supply any present contingencies, Mr. Dorrit? I thought it best to bring a sum of money for the purpose." "Thank you, sir, thank you. I accept with readiness at the present moment what I could not an hour ago have conscientiously taken. I am obliged to you for the temporary accommodation. Exceedingly temporary, but well-timed, well-timed." His hand had closed upon the money, and he carried it about with him. "Be so kind, sir, as to add the amount to those former advances to which I have already referred, being careful, if you please, not to omit advances made to my son. A mere verbal statement of the gross amount is all I shall require." His eye fell upon his daughter at this point, and he stopped for a moment to kiss her and to pat her head. "It will be necessary to find a milliner, my love, and to make a speedy and complete change in your very plain dress. Something must be done with Maggie, too, who at present is barely respectable, and your sister, Amy, and your brother, and my brother, your uncle, poor soul. I trust this will rouse him. Messengers must be dispatched to fetch them. They must be informed of this. We must break it to them cautiously, but they must be informed directly. We owe it as a duty to them and to ourselves from this moment not to let them do anything." This was the first intimation he had ever given that he was privy to the fact that they did something for a livelihood. He was still jogging about the room with the purse clutched in his hand when a great cheering arose in the yard. "The news has spread already," said Clennam, looking down from the window. "Will you show yourself to them, Mr. Dorrit? They are very earnest, and they evidently wish it." I confess I could have desired, Amy, my dear," he said, jogging about in a more feverish flutter than before, "to have made some change in my dress first, and to have bought a watch and chain. But if it must be done as it is, it must be done. Fasten the collar of my shirt, my dear. Mr. Clennam, would you oblige me with a blue neckcloth you will find in that drawer at your elbow? Button my coat across the chest, my love. It looks broader buttoned." With his trembling hand he pushed his grey hair up, and then, taking Clennam and his daughter for supporters, appeared at the window leaning on an arm of each. The collegians cheered him very heartily, and he kissed his hand to them with great urbanity and protection. When he withdrew into the room again, he said, "Poor creatures," in a tone of much pity for their miserable condition. Little Dorrit was deeply anxious that he should lie down to compose himself. On Arthur's speaking to her of his going to inform Banks that he might now appear as soon as he would, and pursue the joyful business to its close, she entreated him in a whisper to stay with her until her father should be quite calm and at rest. He needed no second entreaty, and she prepared her father's bed and begged him to lie down. For another half-hour or more he would be persuaded to do nothing but go about the room, discussing with himself the probabilities for and against the marshal's allowing the whole of the prisoners to go to the windows of the official residence which commanded the street, to see himself and family depart for ever in a carriage, which, he said, he thought would be a sight for them. But gradually he began to droop and tire, and at last stretched himself upon the bed. She took her faithful place beside him, fanning him and cooling his forehead, and he seemed to be falling asleep, always with the money in his hand, when he unexpectedly sat up and said, "Mr. Clennam, I beg your pardon. Am I to understand, my dear sir, that I could pass through the lodge at this moment and, take a walk?" "I think not, Mr. Dorrit," was the unwilling reply. "There are certain forms to be completed, and although your detention here is now in itself a form, I fear it is one that for a little longer has to be observed too." At this he shed tears again. "It is but a few hours, sir," Clennam cheerfully urged upon him. "A few hours, sir," he returned in a sudden passion. "You talk very easily of hours, sir. How long do you suppose, sir, that an hour is to a man who is choking for want of air?" It was his last demonstration for that time, as, after shedding some more tears and querulously complaining that he couldn't breathe, he slowly fell into a slumber. Clennam had abundant occupation for his thoughts, as he sat in the quiet room watching the father on his bed and the daughter fanning his face. Little Dorrit had been thinking too. After softly putting his grey hair aside and touching his forehead with her lips, she looked towards Arthur, who came nearer to her, and pursued in a low whisper the subject of her thoughts. "Mr. Clennam, will he pay all his debts before he leaves here?" "No doubt, all. All the debts for which he had been imprisoned here, all my life and longer?" "No doubt." There was something of uncertainty and remonstrance in her look, something that was not at all satisfaction. He wondered to detect it, and said, "You are glad that he should do so?" "Are you?" asked little Dorrit wistfully. "Am I? Most heartily glad." "Then I know I ought to be." "And are you not?" "It seems to me hard," said little Dorrit, "that he should have lost so many years and suffered so much, and at last pay all the debts as well. It seems hard to me that he should pay in life and money both." "My dear child," Clennam was beginning. "Yes, I know I am wrong," she pleaded timidly. "Don't think any worse of me. It has grown up with me here." The prison, which could spoil so many things, had tainted little Dorrit's mind no more than this. Engendered as the confusion was, in compassion for the poor prisoner, her father, it was the first speck Clennam had ever seen, it was the last speck Clennam ever saw, of the prison atmosphere upon her. He thought this, and forbore to say another word. With the thought, her purity and goodness came before him in their brightest light. The little spot made them the more beautiful. Worn out with her own emotions, and yielding to the silence of the room, her hand slowly slackened and failed in its fanning movement, and her head dropped down on the pillow at her father's side. Clennam rose softly, opened and closed the door without a sound, and passed from the prison, carrying the quiet with him into the turbulent streets. Chapter 36. The Marshalsea becomes an orphan. And now the day arrived when Mr. Dorrit and his family were to leave the prison for ever. and the stones of its much-trodden pavement were to know them no more. The interval had been short, but he had greatly complained of its length, and had been imperious with Mr. Rugg touching the delay. He had been high with Mr. Rugg, and had threatened to employ someone else. He had requested Mr. Rugg not to presume upon the place in which he found him, but to do his duty, sir, and to do it with promptitude. He had told Mr. Rugg that he knew what lawyers and agents were, and that he would not submit to imposition. On that gentleman's humbly representing that he exerted himself to the utmost, Miss Fanny was very short with him, desiring to know what less he could do, when he had been told a dozen times that money was no object, and expressing her suspicion that he forgot whom he talked to. Towards the marshal, who was a marshal of many years' standing, and with whom he had never had any previous difference, Mr. Dorrit comported himself with severity. That officer, on personally tendering his congratulations, offered the free use of 2 rooms in his house for Mr. Dorrit's occupation until his departure. Mr. Dorrit thanked him at the moment, and replied that he would think of it, but the marshal was no sooner gone than he sat down and wrote him a cutting note, in which he remarked that he had never on any former occasion had the honour of receiving his congratulations, which was true, though indeed there had not been anything particular to congratulate him upon, and that he begged on behalf of himself and family to repudiate the marshal's offer with all those thanks which its disinterested character and its perfect independence of all worldly considerations demanded. Although his brother showed so dim a glimmering of interest in their altered fortunes that it was very doubtful whether he understood them, Mr. Dorrit caused him to be measured for new raiment by the hosiers, tailors, hatters, and bootmakers, whom he called in for himself, and ordered that his old clothes should be taken from him and burned. Miss Fanny and Mr. Tip required no direction in making an appearance of great fashion and elegance, and the 3 passed this interval together at the best hotel in the neighbourhood, though truly, as Miss Fanny said, the best was very indifferent. In connection with that establishment, Mr. Tip hired a cabriolet, horse and groom, a very neat turnout, which was usually to be observed for 2 or 3 hours at a time, gracing the Borough High Street, outside the Marshalsea courtyard. A modest little hired chariot and pair was also frequently to be seen there, in alighting from and entering which vehicle Miss Fanny fluttered the marshal's daughters by the display of inaccessible bonnets. A great deal of business was transacted in this short period. Among other items, Messrs. Peddle and Poole, solicitors of Monument Yard, were instructed by their client, Edward Dorrit, Esquire, to address a letter to Mr. Arthur Clennam, enclosing the sum of £24 9 shillings and 8 pence, being the amount of principal and interest computed at the rate of 5% per annum, in which their client believed himself to be indebted to Mr. Clennam. In making this communication and remittance, Messrs. Peddle and Poole were further instructed by their client to remind Mr. Clennam that the favour of the advance now repaid, including gate fees, had not been asked of him, and to inform him that it would not have been accepted if it had been openly proffered in his name. With which they requested a stamped receipt and remained his obedient servants. A great deal of business had likewise to be done within the soon-to-be orphaned Marshalsea, by Dorrit so long its father, chiefly arising out of applications made to him by collegians for small sums of money. To these he responded with the greatest liberality, and with no lack of formality, always first writing to appoint a time at which the applicant might wait upon him in his room, and then receiving him in the midst of a vast accumulation of documents, and accompanying his donation, for he said in every such case, "It is a donation, not a loan," with a great deal of good counsel to the effect that he, the expiring father of the Marshalsea, hoped to be long remembered as an example that a man might preserve his own and the general respect, even there. The collegians were not envious. Besides, they had had a personal and traditional regard for a collegian of so many years' standing. The event was creditable to the college, and made it famous in the newspapers. Perhaps more of them thought, too, than were quite aware of it, that the thing might in the lottery of chances have happened to themselves, or that something of the sort might yet happen to themselves some day or other. They took it very well. A few were low at the thought of being left behind, and being left poor, but even these did not grudge the family their brilliant reverse. There might have been much more envy in politer places. It seems probable that the mediocrity of fortune would have been disposed to be less magnanimous than the collegians, who lived from hand to mouth, from the pawnbroker's hand to the day's dinner. They got up an address to him, which they presented in a neat frame and glass, though it was not afterwards displayed in the family mansion or preserved among the family papers, and to which he returned a gracious answer. In that document he assured them, in a royal manner, that he received the profession of their attachment with a full conviction of its sincerity, and again generally exhorted them to follow his example, which, at least in so far as coming into a great property was concerned, there is no doubt they would have gladly imitated. He took the same occasion of inviting them to a comprehensive entertainment, to be given to the whole college in the yard, and at which he signified he would have the honour of taking a parting glass to the health and happiness of all those whom he was about to leave behind. He did not in person dine at this public repast. It took place at 2 in the afternoon, and his dinners now came in from the hotel at 6. But his son was so good as to take the head of the principal table, and to be very free and engaging. He himself went about among the company, and took notice of individuals, and saw that the viands were of the quality he had ordered, and that they all were served. On the whole, he was like a baron of the olden time in a rare good humour. At the conclusion of the repast, he pledged his guests in a bumper of old Madeira, and told them that he hoped that they had enjoyed themselves, and what was more, that they would enjoy themselves for the rest of the evening, that he wished them well, and that he bade them welcome. His health being drunk with acclamations, he was not so baronial after all, but that in trying to return thanks he broke down, in the manner of a mere serf, with a heart in his breast, and wept before them all. After this great success, which he supposed to be a failure, he gave them Mr. Chivery and his brother officers, whom he had beforehand presented with £10 each, and who were all in attendance. Mr. Chivery spoke to the toast, saying, "What you undertake to lock up, but remember that you are, in the words of the fettered African, a man and a brother ever." The list of toasts disposed of, Mr. Dorrit urbanely went through the motions of playing a game of skittles with the collegian, who was next the oldest inhabitant to himself, and left the tenantry to their diversions. But all these occurrences preceded the final day, and now the day arrived when he and his family were to leave the prison forever, and when the stones of its much-trodden pavement were to know them no more. Noon was the hour appointed for the departure. As it approached, there was not a collegian within doors, nor a turnkey absent. The latter class of gentlemen appeared in their Sunday clothes, and the greater part of the collegians were brightened up as much as circumstances allowed. 2 or 3 flags were even displayed, and the children put on odds and ends of ribbon. Mr. Dorrit himself, at this trying time, preserved a serious but grateful dignity. Much of his great attention was given to his brother, as to whose bearing on the great occasion he felt anxious. "My dear Frederick," said he, "if you will give me your arm, we will pass among our friends together. I think it is right that we should go out arm in arm, my dear Frederick." "Ah," said Frederick, yes. "And if you, my dear Frederick, if you could, without putting any great constraint upon yourself, throw a little, pray excuse me, Frederick, a little polish into your usual demeanour." William," said the other, shaking his head, "it's for you to do all that. I don't know how. All forgotten. "But, my dear fellow," returned William, "for that very reason, if for no other, you must positively try to rouse yourself. What you have forgotten you must now begin to recall, my dear Frederick, your position." "Eh?" said Frederick. "Your position, my dear Frederick." "Mine?" He looked first at his own figure, and then at his brother's, and then, drawing a long breath, cried, "Ah, to be sure, yes. Your position, my dear Frederick, is now a fine one. Your position as my brother is a very fine one, and I know that it belongs to your conscientious nature to try to become worthy of it, my dear Frederick, and to try and adorn it, to be no discredit to it, but to adorn it." "William," said the other weakly, with a sigh, "I will do anything you wish, my brother, provided it lies in my power. Pray be so kind as to recollect what a limited power is mine. What would you wish me to do today, brother? Say what it is, only say what it is." "My dearest Frederick, nothing. It is not worth troubling so good a heart as yours with." "Pray trouble it," returned the other. "It finds it no trouble, William, to do anything it can for you." William passed his hand across his eyes, and murmured with august satisfaction, "Blessings on your attachment, my dear fellow." Then he said aloud, "Well, my dear Frederick, if you will only try as we walk out to show that you are alive or to the occasion, that you think about it." "What would you advise me to think about it?" returned his submissive brother. "Oh, my dear Frederick, how can I answer you? I can only say what, in leaving these good people, I think myself." "That's it," cried his brother. "That will help me. I find that I think, my dear Frederick, and with mixed emotions in which a softened compassion predominates, what will they do without me?" "True," returned his brother. "Yes, yes, yes. I think that as we go, what will they do without my brother? Poor things, what will they do without him?" 12 o'clock having just struck, and the carriage being reported ready in the outer courtyard, the brothers proceeded downstairs, arm in arm. Edward Dorrit, Esquire, once Tip, and his sister Fanny followed also arm in arm. Mr. Plornish and Maggie, to whom had been entrusted the removal of such of the family effects as were considered worth removing, followed, bearing bundles and burdens to be packed in a cart. In the yard were the collegians and turnkeys. In the yard were Mr. Panks and Mr. Rugg, come to see the last touch given to their work. In the yard was young John making a new epitaph for himself on the occasion of his dying of a broken heart. In the yard was the patriarchal Casby, looking so tremendously benevolent that many enthusiastic collegians grasped him fervently by the hand, and the wives and female relatives of many more collegians kissed his hand, nothing doubting that he had done it all. In the yard was the man with the shadowy grievance respecting the fund which the marshal embezzled, who had got up at 5 in the morning to complete the copying of a perfectly unintelligible history of that transaction, which he had committed to Mr. Dorrit's care as a document of the last importance, calculated to stun the government and effect the marshal's downfall. In the yard was the insolvent, whose utmost energies were always set on getting into debt, and who broke into prison with as much pains as other men have broken out of it, and who was always being cleared and complimented, while the insolvent at his elbow, a mere little snivelling, striving tradesman, half dead of anxious efforts to keep out of debt, found it a hard matter indeed to get a commissioner to release him with much reproof and reproach. In the yard was the man of many children and many burdens, whose failure astonished everybody. In the yard was the man of no children and large resources, whose failure astonished nobody. There were the people who were always going out tomorrow, and always putting it off. There were the people who had come in yesterday, and who were much more jealous and resentful of this freak of fortune than the seasoned birds. There were some who, in pure meanness of spirit, cringed and bowed before the enriched collegian and his family. There were others who did so really because their eyes, accustomed to the gloom of their imprisonment and poverty, could not support the light of such bright sunshine. There were many whose shilling had gone into his pocket to buy him meat and drink, but none who were now obtrusively hail fellow well met with him on the strength of that assistance. It was rather to be remarked of the caged birds that they were a little shy of the bird about to be so grandly free, and that they had a tendency to withdraw themselves towards the bars and seem a little fluttered as he passed. Through these spectators, the little procession, headed by the two brothers, moved slowly to the gate. Mr. Dorrit, yielding to the vast speculation how the poor creatures were to get on without him, was great and sad, but not absorbed. He patted children on the head like Sir Roger de Coverley, going to church. He spoke to people in the background by their Christian names. He condescended to all present, and seemed for their consolation to walk encircled by the legend in golden characters. Be comforted, my people, bear it. At last, 3 honest cheers announced that he had passed the gate, and that the Marshalsea was an orphan. Before they had ceased to ring in the echoes of the prison walls, the family had got into their carriage, and the attendant had the steps in his hand. Then, and not before. "Good gracious!" cried Miss Fanny all at once. "Where's Amy?" Her father had thought she was with her sister. Her sister had thought she was somewhere or other. They had all trusted to finding her, as they had always done, quietly in the right place at the right moment. This going away was perhaps the very first action of their joint lives that they had got through without her. A minute might have been consumed in the ascertaining of these points, when Miss Fanny, who, from her seat in the carriage, commanded the long narrow passage leading to the lodge, flushed indignantly. "Now do I say, Pa," cried she, "that this is disgraceful." "What is disgraceful, Fanny?" "I do say," she repeated, "this is perfectly infamous, really almost enough, even at such a time as this, to make one wish one was dead. Here is that child Amy in her ugly old shabby dress, which she was so obstinate about, Pa, which I over and over again begged and prayed her to change, and which she over and over again objected to, and promised to change today, saying she wished to wear it as long as ever she remained in there with you, which was absolutely romantic nonsense of the lowest kind. Here is that child Amy disgracing us to the last moment, and at the last moment by being carried out in that dress after all. And by that Mr. Clennam, too." The offence was proved as she delivered the indictment. Clennam appeared at the carriage door, bearing the little insensible figure in his arms. "She has been forgotten," he said in a tone of pity not free from reproach. "I ran up to her room, which Mr. Chivery showed me, and found the door open, and that she had fainted on the floor, dear child. She appeared to have gone to change her dress, and to have sunk down overpowered. It may have been the cheering, or it may have happened sooner. Take care of this poor cold hand, Miss Dorrit. Don't let it fall." "Thank you, sir," returned Miss Dorrit, bursting into tears. "I believe I know what to do, if you will give me leave. Dear Amy, open your eyes, that's a love. Oh, Amy, Amy, I really am so vexed and ashamed. Do rouse yourself, darling. Oh, why are they not driving on? Pray, Pa, do drive on." The attendant, getting between Clennam and the carriage door, with a sharp "By your leave, sir," bundled up the steps, and they drove away. Book the Second, Riches. Chapter 1. Fellow Travellers. In the autumn of the year, darkness and night were creeping up to the highest ridges of the Alps. It was vintage time in the valleys on the Swiss side of the pass of the giant Saint Bernard, and along the banks of the Lake Geneva. The air there was charged with the scent of gathered grapes. Baskets, troughs, and tubs of grapes stood in the dim village doorways, stopped the steep and narrow village streets, and had been carrying all day along the roads and lanes. Grapes, split and crushed underfoot, lay about everywhere. The children, carried in a sling by the laden peasant woman toiling home, was quieted with picked-up grapes. The idiot, sunning his big goiter under the leaves of the wooden chalet by the way to the waterfall, sat munching grapes. The breath of the cows and goats was redolent of leaves and stalks of grapes. The company in every little cabaret were eating, drinking, talking grapes. A pity that no ripe touch of this generous abundance could be given to the thin, hard, stony wine, which after all was made from the grapes. The air had been warm and transparent through the whole of the bright day. Shining metal spires and church roofs, distant and rarely seen, had sparkled in the view, and the snowy mountain tops had been so clear that unaccustomed eyes, cancelling the intervening country and slighting their rugged heights for something fabulous, would have measured them as within a few hours' easy reach. Mountain peaks of great celebrity in the valleys, whence no trace of their existence was visible sometimes for months together, had been since morning plain and near in the blue sky. And now, when it was dark below, though they seemed solemnly to recede, like spectres who were going to vanish, as the red dye of the sunset faded out of them and left them coldly white, they were yet distinctly defined in their loneliness above the mists and shadows. Seen from these solitudes, and from the pass of the great Saint Bernard, which was one of them, the ascending night came up the mountain like a rising water. When it at last rose to the walls of the convent of the great Saint Bernard, it was as if that weather-beaten structure were another ark and floated on the shadowy waves. Darkness, outstripping some visitors on mules, had risen thus to the rough convent walls when those travellers were yet climbing the mountain. As the heat of the glowing day, when they had stopped to drink at the streams of melted ice and snow, was changed to the searching cold of the frosty, rarefied night air at a great height, so the fresh beauty of the lower journey had yielded to barrenness and desolation. A craggy track, up which the mules in single file scrambled and turned from block to block, as though they were ascending the broken staircase of a gigantic ruin, was their way now. No trees were to be seen, nor any vegetable growth save a poor brown scrubby moss, freezing in the chinks of rock. Blackened skeleton arms of wood by the wayside pointed upward to the convent, as if the ghosts of former travellers overwhelmed by the snow haunted of the scene of their distress. Icicle-hung caves and cellars built for refuges from sudden storms were like so many whispers of the perils of the place. Never-resting wreaths and mazes of mist wandered about, hunted by a moaning wind and snow, the besetting danger of the mountain, against which all its defences were taken, drifted sharply down. The file of mules, jaded by their day's work, turned and wound slowly up the deep ascent, the foremost led by a guide on foot, in his broad-brimmed hat and round jacket, carrying a mountain staff or two upon his shoulder, with whom another guide conversed. There was no speaking among the string of riders. The sharp cold, the fatigue of the journey, and a new sensation of a catching in the breath, partly as if they had just emerged from very clear, crisp water, and partly as if they had been sobbing, kept them silent. At length, a light on the summit of the rocky staircase gleamed through the snow and mist. The guides called to the mules pricked up their drooping heads, the travellers' tongues were loosened, and in a sudden burst of slipping, climbing, jingling, clinking, and talking, they arrived at the convent door. Other mules had arrived not long before, some with peasant riders and some with goods, and had trodden the snow about the door into a pool of mud. Riding saddles and bridles, pack saddles and strings of bells, mules and men, lanterns, torches, sacks, provender, barrels, cheeses, kegs of honey and butter, straw bundles and packages of many shapes, were crowded confusedly together in this thawed quagmire and about the steps. Up here in the clouds, everything was seen through cloud, and seemed dissolving into cloud. The breath of the men was cloud, the breath of the mules was cloud, the lights were encircled by cloud, speakers close at hand were not seen for cloud, though their voices and all other sounds were surprisingly clear. Of the cloudy line of mules hastily tied to rings in the wall, one would bite another or kick another, and then the whole mist would be disturbed, with men diving into it, and cries of men and beasts coming out of it, and no bystander discerning what was wrong. In the midst of this, the great stable of the convent, occupying the basement story, and entered by the basement door, outside which all the disorder was, poured forth its contribution of cloud, as if the whole rugged edifice were filled with nothing else, and would collapse as soon as it had emptied itself, leaving the snow to fall upon the bare mountain summit. While all this noise and hurry were rife among the living travellers, there, too, silently assembled in a grated house 6 paces removed, with the same cloud enfolding them and the same snow flakes drifting in upon them, were the dead travellers found upon the mountain. The mother, storm-belated many winters ago, still standing in the corner with her baby at her breast, the man who had frozen with his arm raised to his mouth in fear or hunger, still pressing it with his dry lips after years and years. An awful company mysteriously come together, a wild destiny for that mother to have foreseen. Surrounded by so many and such companions upon whom I never looked, and never shall look, I and my child will dwell together inseparable on the great Saint Bernard, outlasting generations who will come to see us, and will never know our name or one word of our story but the end. The living travellers thought little or nothing of the dead just then. They thought much more of alighting at the convent door and warming themselves at the convent fire. Disengaged from the turmoil which was already calming down as the crowd of mules began to be bestowed in the stable, they hurried shivering up the steps and into the building. There was a smell within, coming up from the floor, of tethered beasts, like the smell of a menagerie of wild animals. There were strong arched galleries within, huge stone piers, great staircases, and thick walls pierced with small sunken windows, fortifications against the mountain storms, as if they had been human enemies. There were gloomy vaulted sleeping rooms within, intensely cold, but clean and hospitably prepared for guests. Finally, there was a parlour for guests to sit in and sup in, where a table was already laid, and where a blazing fire shone red and high. In this room, after having had their quarters for the night allotted to them by two young fathers, the travellers presently drew round the hearth. They were in 3 parties, of whom the first, as the most numerous and important, was the slowest, and had been overtaken by one of the others on the way up. It consisted of an elderly lady, 2 grey-haired gentlemen, 2 young ladies, and their brother. These were attended, not to mention 4 guides, by a courier, 2 footmen, and 2 waiting maids, which strong body of inconvenience was accommodated elsewhere under the same roof. The party that had overtaken them and followed in their train consisted of only 3 members, 1 lady and 2 gentlemen. The third party, which had ascended from the valley on the Italian side of the pass, and had arrived first, were 4 in number, a plethoric, hungry, and silent German tutor in spectacles, on a tour with 3 young men, his pupils, all plethoric, hungry, and silent, and all in spectacles. These 3 groups sat round the fire, eyeing each other dryly, and waiting for supper. Only one among them, one of the gentlemen belonging to the party of 3, made advances towards conversation. Throwing out his lines for the chief of the important tribe, while addressing himself to his own companions, he remarked in a tone of voice which included all the company if they chose to be included, that it had been a long day, and that he felt for the ladies. That he feared one of the young ladies was not a strong or accustomed traveller, and had been over-fatigued 2 or 3 hours ago. That he had observed, from his station in the rear, that she sat her mule as if she were exhausted. That he had, twice or thrice afterwards, done himself the honour of inquiring of one of the guides, when he fell behind, how the lady did. That he had been enchanted to learn that she had recovered her spirits, and that it had been but a passing discomfort. That he trusted, by this time he had secured the eyes of the chief and addressed him, he might be permitted to express his hope that she was now none the worse, and that she would not regret having made the journey. "My daughter, I am obliged to you, sir," returned the chief, "is quite restored and has been greatly interested." "New to mountains, perhaps?" said the insinuating traveller. "New to mountains," said the chief. "But you are familiar with them, sir," the insinuating traveller assumed. "I am tolerably familiar. Not of late years, replied the chief with a flourish of his hand. The insinuating traveller, acknowledging the flourish with an inclination of his head, passed from the chief to the second young lady, who had not yet been referred to otherwise than as one of the ladies in whose behalf he felt so sensitive an interest. He hoped she had not been incommoded by the fatigues of the day. "Incommoded, certainly," returned the young lady, "but not tired." The insinuating traveller complimented her on the injustice of the distinction, It was what he had meant to say. Every lady must doubtless be incommoded by having to do with that proverbially unaccommodating animal, the mule. "We have had, of course," said the young lady, who was rather reserved and haughty, "to leave the carriages and fourgon at Martigny, and the impossibility of bringing anything that one wants to this inaccessible place, and the necessity of leaving every comfort behind is not convenient." "A savage place indeed," said the insinuating traveller. The elderly lady, who was a model of accurate dressing, and whose manner was perfect, considered as a piece of machinery, here interposed a remark in a low, soft voice. "But, unlike other inconvenient places," she observed, "it must be seen. As a place much spoken of, it is necessary to see it." "Oh, I have not the least objection to seeing it, I assure you, Mrs. General," returned the other carelessly. "You, madam," said the insinuating traveller, "have visited this spot before?" "Yes," returned Mrs. General, "I have been here before. Let me commend you, my dear," to the former young lady, "to shade your face from the hot wood after exposure to the mountain air and snow. You too, my dear," to the other and younger lady, who immediately did so, while the former merely said, "Thank you, Mrs. General, I am perfectly comfortable, and I prefer remaining as I am." The brother, who had left his chair to open a piano that stood in the room, and who had whistled into it and shut it up again, now came strolling back to the fire with his glass in his eye. He was dressed in the very fullest and completest travelling trim. The world seemed hardly large enough to yield him an amount of travel proportionate to his equipment. "These fellows are an immense time with supper," he drawled. "I wonder what they'll give us. Has anybody any idea?" "Not roast, man, I believe," replied the voice of the second gentleman of the party of three. "I suppose not. What do you mean?" he inquired. "That, as you are not to be served for the general supper, perhaps you will do us the favour of not cooking yourself at the general fire," returned the other. The young gentleman, who was standing in an easy attitude on the hearth, cocking his glass at the company, with his back to the blaze and his coat tucked under his arms, something as if he were of the paltry species and would trust for roasting, lost countenance at this reply. He seemed about to demand further explanation, when it was discovered, through all eyes turning on the speaker, that the lady with him, who was young and beautiful, had not heard what had passed through having fainted with her head upon his shoulder. "I think," said the gentleman in a subdued tone, "I had best carry her straight to her room. Will you call to someone to bring a light," addressing his companion, "and to show the way? In this strange rambling place I don't know that I could find it." "Pray, let me call my maid," cried the taller of the young ladies. "Pray, let me put this water to her lips," said the shorter, who had not spoken yet. Each doing what she suggested, there was no want of assistance. Indeed, when the two maids came in, escorted by the courier lest anyone should strike them dumb by addressing a foreign language to them on the road, there was a prospect of too much assistance. Seeing this, and saying as much in a few words to the slighter and younger of the two ladies, the gentleman put his wife's arm over his shoulder, lifted her up, and carried her away. His friend, being left alone with the other visitors, walked slowly up and down the room without coming to the fire again, pulling his black moustache in a contemplative manner, as if he felt himself committed to the late retort. While the subject of it was breathing injury in a corner, the chief loftily addressed this gentleman. "Your friend, sir," said he, "is a little impatient, and in his impatience is not perhaps fully sensible of what he owes but we will waive that. Your friend is a little impatient, sir." "It may be so, sir," returned the other, "but having had the honour of making that gentleman's acquaintance at the hotel at Geneva, where we and much good company met some time ago, and having had the honour of exchanging company and conversation with that gentleman on several subsequent excursions, I can hear nothing, no, not even from one of your appearance and station, sir, detrimental to that gentleman." "You are in no danger, sir, of hearing any such thing from me. In remarking that your friend has shown impatience, I say no such thing. I make that remark because it is not to be doubted that my son, being by birth and by by education a gentleman, would have readily adapted himself to any obligingly expressed wish on the subject of the fire being equally accessible to the whole of the present circle, which in principle for all are equal on these occasions, I consider right. Good, was the reply, and there it ends. I am your son's obedient servant. I beg your son to receive the assurance of my profound consideration, and now, sir, I may freely admit, that my friend is sometimes of a sarcastic temper. The lady is your friend's wife, sir? The lady is my friend's wife, sir. She is very handsome. Sir, she is peerless. They are still in the first year of their marriage. They are still partly on a marriage and partly on an artistic tour. Your friend is an artist, sir. The gentleman replied by kissing the fingers of his right hand and wafting the kiss the length of his arm towards heaven, as who should say, I devote him to the celestial powers as an immortal artist. But he is a man of family, he added. His connections are of the best. He is more than an artist. He is highly connected. He may, in effect, have repudiated his connections proudly, impatiently, sarcastically. I make the concessions of both words, but he has them. Sparks that have been struck out during our intercourse have shown me this. Well, I hope, said the lofty gentleman, with the air of finally disposing of the subject, that the lady's indisposition may be only temporary. Sir, I hope so. Mere fatigue, I dare say. Not altogether mere fatigue, sir, for her mule stumbled today, and she fell from the saddle. She fell lightly and was up again without assistance, and rode from us laughing, but she complained towards evening of a slight bruise on the side. She spoke of it more than once, as we followed your party up the mountain. The head of the large retinue, who was gracious but not familiar, appeared by this time to think that he had condescended more than enough. He said no more, and there was silence for some quarter of an hour until supper appeared. With the supper came one of the young fathers — there seemed to be no old fathers — to take the head of the table. It was like the supper of an ordinary Swiss hotel, and good red wine grown by the convent in more genial air was not wanting. The artist-traveller calmly came and took his place at table when the rest sat down, with no apparent sense upon him of his late skirmish with the completely dressed traveller. Pray, he inquired of the host over his soup, has your convent many of its famous dogs now? Monsieur, it has 3. I saw 3 in the gallery below, doubtless the 3 in question. The host, a slender, bright-eyed, dark young man of polite manners, whose garment was a black gown with strips of white crossed over it like braces, and who no more resembled the conventional breed of St. Bernard monks than he resembled the conventional breed of St. Bernard dogs, replied, doubtless those were the 3 in question. And I think, said the artist-traveller, I have seen one of them before. It was possible. He was a dog sufficiently well known. Monsieur might have easily seen him in the valley or somewhere on the lake, when he, the dog, had gone down with one of the order to solicit aid for the convent. Which is done in its regular season of the year, I think? Monsieur was right. And never without a dog. The dog is very important. Again, Monsieur was right. The dog was very important. People were justly interested in the dog, as one of the dogs celebrated everywhere, Mademoiselle would observe. Mademoiselle was a little slow to observe it, as though she were not yet well accustomed to the French tongue. Mrs. General, however, observed it for her. Ask him if he has saved many lives, said, in his native English, the young man who had been put out of countenance. The host needed no translation of the question. He promptly replied in French, No, not this one. Why not? The same gentleman asked. Pardon, returned the host composedly. Give him the opportunity, and he will do it without doubt. For example, I am well convinced, smiling sedately as he cut up the dish of veal to be handed round on the young man who had been put out of countenance, that if you, monsieur, would give him the opportunity, he would hasten with great ardour to fulfil his duty. The artist traveller laughed. The insinuating traveller, who evinced a provident anxiety to get his full share of the supper, wiping some drops of wine from his moustache with a piece of bread, joined the conversation. "It is becoming late in the year, my father," said he, "for tourist travellers, is it not?" "Yes, it is late. Yet 2 or 3 weeks at most, and we shall be left to the winter snows." "And then," said the insinuating traveller, "for the scratching dogs and the buried children according to the pictures." "Pardon?" said the host, not quite understanding the allusion. "How then the scratching dogs and the buried children according to the pictures?" The artist traveller struck in again before an answer could be given. "Don't you know," he coldly inquired across the table of his companion, "that none but smugglers come this way in winter or can have any possible business this way?" "Holy blue! No, never heard of it." "So it is, I believe. And as they know the signs of the weather tolerably well, they don't give much employment to the dogs, who have consequently died out rather, though this house of entertainment is conveniently situated for themselves. Their young families, I am told, they usually leave at home. But it's a grand idea," cried the artist-traveller unexpectedly, rising into a tone of enthusiasm. "It's a sublime idea. It's the finest idea in the world, and brings tears into a man's eyes, by Jupiter." He then went on eating his veal with great composure. There was enough of mocking inconsistency at the bottom of this speech to make it rather discordant, though the manner was refined, and the person well-favoured, and though the deprecatory part of it was so skilfully thrown off as to be very difficult for one not perfectly acquainted with the English language to understand, or, even understanding, to take offence at, so simple and dispassionate was its tone. After finishing his veal in the midst of silence, the speaker again addressed his friend. "Look," said he, in his former tone, "at this gentleman our host, not yet in the prime of life, who in so graceful a way and with such courtly urbanity and modesty presides over us. Manners fit for a crown. Dine with the Lord Mayor of London, if you can get an invitation, and observe the contrast. This dear fellow, with the finest cut face I ever saw, a face in perfect drawing, leaves some laborious life and comes up here I don't know how many feet above the level of the sea, for no other purpose on earth, except enjoying himself, I hope, in a capital refectory, than to keep an hotel for idle poor devils like you and me, and leave the bill to our consciences. Why, isn't it a beautiful sacrifice? What do you want more to touch us? Because rescued people of interesting appearance are not for 8 or 9 months out of every 12 holding on here round the necks of the most sagacious of dogs carrying wooden bottles. Shall we disparage the place? No. Bless the place. It's a great place, a glorious place." The chest of the grey-haired gentleman, who was the chief of the important party, had swelled as if with a protest against his being numbered among poor devils. No sooner had the artist-traveller ceased speaking than he himself spoke with great dignity, as having it incumbent upon him to take the lead in most places, and having deserted that duty for a little while. He weightily communicated his opinion to their host, that his life must be a very dreary life here in the winter. The host allowed to Monsieur that it was a little monotonous. The air was difficult to breathe for a length of time consecutively. The cold was very severe. One needed youth and strength to bear it. However, having them and the blessing of heaven— yes, that was very good. But the confinement, said the grey-haired gentleman. There were many days, even in bad weather, when it was possible to walk about outside. It was the custom to beat a little track and take exercise there. But the space, urged the grey-haired gentleman, so small, so very limited. Monsieur would recall to himself that there were the refuges to visit, and that tracks had to be made to them also. Monsieur still urged, on the other hand, that the space was so very contracted. More than that, it was always the same, always the same. With a deprecating smile, the host gently raised and gently lowered his shoulders. That was true, he remarked, but permit me to say that almost all objects had their various points of view. Monsieur and he did not see this poor life of his from the same point of view. Monsieur was not used to confinement. "Ah, yes, very true," said the grey-haired gentleman. He seemed to receive quite a shock from the force of the argument. Monsieur, as an English traveller, surrounded by all means of travelling pleasantly, doubtless possessing fortune, carriages, and servants— Perfectly, perfectly, without doubt, said the gentleman. Monsieur could not easily place himself in the position of a person who had not the power to choose. I will go here tomorrow or there next day. I will pass these barriers. I will enlarge those bounds. Monsieur could not realize, perhaps, how the mind accommodated itself in such things to the force of necessity. It is true, said Monsieur. We will not pursue the subject. You are quite accurate, I have no doubt. We will say no more. The supper having come to a close, he drew his chair away as he spoke, and moved back to his former place by the fire. As it was very cold at the greater part of the table, the other guests also resumed their former seats by the fire, designing to toast themselves well before going to bed. The host, when they rose from the table, bowed to all present, wished them good night, and withdrew. But first the insinuating traveller had asked him if they could have some wine made hot, and as he had answered yes, and had presently afterwards sent it in, that traveller, seated in the centre of the group, and in the full heat of the fire, was soon engaged in serving it out to the rest. At this time, the younger of the two young ladies, who had been silently attentive in her dark corner— the firelight was the chief light in the sombre room, the lamp being smoky and dull— to what had been said of the absent lady, glided out. She was at a loss which way to turn when she had softly closed the door, but after a little hesitation among the sounding passages and the many ways, came to a room in a corner of the main gallery, where the servants were at their supper. From these she obtained a lamp and a direction to the lady's room. It was up the great staircase on the story above. Here and there the bare white walls were broken by an iron gate, and she thought as she went along that the place was something like a prison. The arched door of the lady's room or cell was not quite shut. After knocking at it 2 or 3 times without receiving an answer, she pushed it gently open and looked in. The lady lay with closed eyes on the outside of the bed, protected from the cold by the blankets and wrappers with which she had been covered when she revived from her fainting fit. A dull light, placed in the deep recess of the window, made little impression on the arched room. The visitor timidly stepped to the bed and said in a soft whisper, "Are you better?" The lady had fallen into a slumber, and the whisper was too low to awake her. Her visitor, standing quite still, looked at her attentively. "She is very pretty," she said to herself. "I never saw so beautiful a face. Oh, how unlike me!" It was a curious thing to say, but it had some hidden meaning, for it filled her eyes with tears. I know I must be right. I know he spoke of her that evening. I could very easily be wrong on any other subject, but not on this, not on this. With a quiet and tender hand she put aside a straying fold of the sleeper's hair, and then touched the hand that lay outside the covering. "I like to look at her," she breathed to herself. "I like to see what has affected him so much." She had not withdrawn her hand when the sleeper opened her eyes and started. "Pray, don't be alarmed. I am only one of the travellers from downstairs. I came to ask if you were better, and if I could do anything for you. I think you have already been so kind as to send your servants to my assistance." "No, not I. That was my sister. Are you better?" "Much better. It is only a slight bruise, and has been well looked into, and it is almost easy now. It made me giddy and faint in a moment. It had hurt me before, but at last it overpowered me all at once." "May I stay with you until someone comes? Would you like it?" "I should like it, for it is lonely here, but I am afraid you will feel the cold too much." "I don't mind cold. I am not delicate, if I look so." She quickly moved one of the 2 rough chairs to the bedside and sat down. The other as quickly moved a part of some travelling wrapper from herself, and drew it over her so that her arm, in keeping it about her, rested on her shoulder. "You have so much the air of a kind nurse," said the lady, smiling on her, "that you seem as if you had come to me from home." "I'm very glad of it. I was dreaming of home when I woke just now, of my old home, I mean, before I was married." "And before you were so very far away from it?" I have been much farther away from it than this, but then I took the best part of it with me and missed nothing. I felt solitary as I dropped to sleep here, and, missing it a little, wandered back to it." There was a sorrowfully affectionate and regretful sound in her voice, which made her visitor refrain from looking at her for the moment. "It is a curious chance which at last brings us together under this covering which you have wrapped me," said the visitor, after a pause, "for do you know, I think I have been looking for you for some time." "Looking for me? I believe I have a little note here which I was to give you whenever I found you. This is it. Unless I greatly mistake, it is addressed to you. Is it not?" The lady took it and said yes, and read it. Her visitor watched her as she did so. It was very short. She flushed a little as she put her lips to her visitor's cheek and pressed her hand. "The dear young friend to whom he presents me may be a comfort to me at some time," he says. "She is truly a comfort to me the first time I see her." "Perhaps you don't," said the visitor, hesitating. "Perhaps you don't know my story. Perhaps he never told you my story." "No." "Oh, no, why should he? I have scarcely the right to tell it myself at present, because I have been entreated not to do so. There is not much in it, but it might account to you for my asking you not to say anything about the letter here. You saw my family with me, perhaps. Some of them, I only say this to you, are a little proud, a little prejudiced." "You shall take it back again," said the other, "and then my husband is sure not to see it. He might see it and speak of it, otherwise by some accident. Would you put it in your bosom again, to be certain?" She did so with great care. Her small, slight hand was still open upon the letter when they heard someone in the gallery outside. "I promised," said the visitor, rising, "that I would write to him after seeing you. I could hardly fail to see you sooner or later, and tell him if you were well and happy. I had better say you were well and happy." "Yes, yes, yes. Say I was very well and very happy, and that I thanked him affectionately and would never forget him. I shall see you in the morning. After that we are sure to meet again before very long. Good night." "Good night. Thank you, thank you. Good night, my dear." Both of them were hurried and fluttered as they exchanged this parting, and as the visitor came out of the door. She had expected to meet the lady's husband approaching it, but the person in the gallery was not he. It was the traveller who had wiped the wine-drops from his moustache with a piece of bread. When he heard the step behind him, he turned round, for he was walking away in the dark. His politeness, which was extreme, would not allow of the young lady's lighting herself downstairs or going down alone. He took her lamp, held it so as to throw the best light on the stone steps, and followed her all the way to the supper-room. She went down, not easily hiding how much she was inclined to shrink and tremble, for the appearance of this traveller was particularly disagreeable to her. She had sat down in her quiet corner before supper, imagining what he would have been in the scenes and places within her experience, until he inspired her with an aversion that made him little less than terrific. He followed her down with his smiling politeness, followed her in, and resumed his seat in the best place in the hearth. There, with the wood fire, which was beginning to burn low, rising and falling upon him in the dark room, he sat with his legs thrust out to warm, drinking the hot wine down to the lees, with a monstrous shadow imitating him on the wall and ceiling. The tired company had broken up, and all the rest were gone to bed, except the young lady's father, who dozed in his chair by the fire. The traveller had been at the pains of going a long way upstairs to his sleeping-room to fetch his pocket flask of brandy. He told them so as he poured its contents into what was left of the wine and drank with a new relish. "May I ask you, sir, if you are on your way to Italy?" The grey-haired gentleman had roused himself and was preparing to withdraw. He answered in the affirmative. "I also," said the traveller. "I shall hope to have the honour of offering my compliments in fairer scenes and under softer circumstances than on this dismal mountain." The gentleman bowed distantly enough, and said he was obliged to him. "We poor gentlemen, sir," said the traveller, pulling his moustache dry with his hand, for he had dipped it in the wine and brandy, "we poor gentlemen do not travel like princes, but the courtesies and graces of life are precious to us. To your health, sir." Sir, I thank you. To the health of your distinguished family, of the fair ladies your daughters. Sir, I thank you again. I wish you good night. My dear, are our people in attendance? They are close by, father. Permit me, said the traveller, rising and holding the door open as the gentleman crossed the room towards it with his arm drawn through his daughter's. Good repose. To the pleasure of seeing you once more. To tomorrow. As he kissed his hand with his best manner and his daintiest smile, the young lady drew a little nearer to her father, and passed him with a dread of touching him. Said the insinuating traveller, whose manner shrunk and whose voice dropped when he was left alone. If they all go to bed, why, I must go. They are in a devil of a hurry. One would think the night would be long enough in this freezing silence and solitude if one went to bed 2 hours hence. Throwing back his head in emptying his glass, he cast his eyes upon the traveller's book which lay on the piano, open, with pens and ink beside it, as if the knights' names had been registered when he was absent. Taking it in his hand, he read these entries. William Dorrit, Esquire. Frederick Dorrit, Esquire. Edward Dorrit, Esquire. Miss Dorrit, Miss Amy Dorrit, Mrs. General and Sweet, from France to Italy. Mr. and Mrs. Henry Gowan, from France to Italy. To which he added, in a small, complicated hand, ending with a long, lean flourish, not unlike a lasso thrown at all the rest of the names, Blanc d'Oie, Paris, from France to Italy. And then, with his nose coming down over his moustache, and his moustache going up and under his nose, repaired to his allotted cell.